All right. I am introducing a talk by Dr. Wendell Laryea Adjetey. I'm sorry, I mispronounced your name there. He is assistant professor and specialist in post-Reconstruction US and African diaspora history at McGill. He's the author of a book called Cross-Border Cosmopolitans, The Making of a Pan-African North America, which I think is exactly in line with what we have been talking about today. He's just talking about something a little further chronologically in the future. Dr. Adjetey is back-to-back recipient of McGill's 2 teaching commendations, 2023 Principals Prize for Excellence in Teaching and 2022 H. Noel Fieldhouse Award for Distinguished Teaching. And today he is going to be sharing a talk called An Act of Identification, Pan-Africanism and African Liberation Day in San Francisco, 1972. And then after he has done his talk, we'll come back and do a little bit of reflection, and I will share some more potential teaching resources with you. All right, so Wendell, if you want to share your screen, welcome.
Okay, good afternoon here. I think good morning, maybe over there. Pardon me, there's a little human being here who is as loquacious as any academic, and so I have tried to distract him the time being, so please bear with me. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much, Shane, for your kind introduction, Martha, for your invitation. I will provide a sort of brief presentation, just looking at one of the significant chapters in the Black freedom struggle in the 20th century, which often goes underappreciated or under-acknowledged. So my presentation is entitled An Act of Identification, Pan-Africanism and African Liberation Day in San Francisco, 1972. So by way of introduction, again, my name is Wendell Laryea Adjetey. My kinsmen and kinswomen and others. Yes, Daddy G. Laryea. Kinsmen and kinswomen on the African continent call me Ni Laryea Osabu, Ken Clermont, Atriko, Ibrahim, Koblaya Manche. In all things, I give thanks to the Creator. I give thanks to the God of my ancestors, to the covenant of my ancestors, Osabu, Osabu, Olaite, Ogidi Gidi, Gbegbete Gbete, I give thanks. Yes, I give thanks as well to the spirit of my ancestors, Atriko, Sisaji, Nyancho. So, a sub-theme in my brief presentation today is this notion of know thyself, the significance of knowing thyself and African peoples remaining grounded and having a very healthy sense of who they are. And I think this is what Maura McLean in part tried to convey in her presentation on the great Leo Hansberry, and the importance of understanding Africans and who we are in terms of antiquity, our antecedents before arrival in the middle or via the Middle Passage in the Americas. And so this notion of knowing thyself, often people say that the most important thing that teachers can convey, the most important thing that teachers do is to teach themselves, right? To give their pupils, their charges, a sense of who they are. And so this notion of knowing thyself is really profound. And one need not be a Black teacher to convey this spirit of self-knowledge and self-awareness to Black students. A teacher need not share sort of the same intimate identities as their students to help inculcate a healthy sense of self. And it's a healthy sense of self that in many ways would catalyze various Black liberation movements across the Americas, and certainly the United States, and certainly in the 20th century. And so, brief presentation, I'll first examine the civil rights movement, what we often refer to as the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and the shortcomings of this movement. And then I'll transition to the rise of Black power and revolutionary Pan-Africanism. So most of us are familiar with the narrative of the civil rights movement and the push to integrate various neighborhoods, workplaces, social spaces, et cetera, even learning spaces. And so the civil rights movement in many ways promised notions of equality, notions of enfranchisement, the ballot, via the Voting Rights Act. The civil rights movement promised in some ways notions of dignity, racial dignity to the African American masses. But of course, the civil rights movement, notwithstanding all these promises, the civil rights movement had many handicaps. The civil rights movement was in fact hamstrung by the persistent and almost intractable inequalities that afflicted the African American masses, the quote unquote Negro masses. And the civil rights movement's lack of significant change in terms of improving the material security of ordinary Black people illustrated to the Black masses that this mass movement, this cataclysmic struggle in many ways would leave so many families behind. And so we had this struggle for material security on one hand, and then we have another struggle for personal security. And this notion of personal security, which often invokes images of attack dogs, fire hoses, National Guardsmen pointing bayonets or 50 caliber machine guns at Black civilians from Newark to Watts, you name it. These images of police and other state officials terrorizing Black men, Black women, Black children, really etched something in the psyche of African peoples in the United States. And this, of course, was not new. Racial terrorism is in many ways as American as the Declaration of Independence. And so amidst this civil rights movement, of course, by the mid-1960s, and certainly with the very militant rhetoric, unapologetic rhetoric, the self-assertive rhetoric of the late, great Malik El-Shabazz or Omowale Malcolm X, and the insistence upon African peoples exercise not any constitutional rights, not any human-made rights, but their God-given rights to protect themselves, to protect their loved ones, to protect their communities, to protect their properties, that this was inalienable. And in fact, this was an ethic that enslaved Africans exercised throughout the Americas, and even during the Middle Passage, and even, of course, in the various holding cells along the Atlantic coast of Africa. And so this transition that certainly happens rapidly after Malcolm X's fateful assassination on the 21st of February, 1965, and Malcolm's martyrdom, we see a new crop of Black men and women who are very militant, unapologetic, in invoking this notion of Black power, right? By 1966, certainly in the Bay Area, in Oakland, with the rise of the Black Panther Party for self-defense, if I may add that caveat, there was a general understanding that the freedom struggle, the civil rights movement, in many ways had failed. On one hand, it had provided sort of a nominal transition in terms of incorporating members of the Black middle class or those who were middle class aspiring or adjacent. But for the vast majority of African Americans, whether they're in the Deep South or they were in these post-industrial and soon to become post-industrial cities in the urban North, the freedom struggle was devastating Black families. And so with the rise of Black power by 1966, emerging in Oakland and throughout the Bay Area and quickly spreading across the country, there was a new ethos in town. And certainly this ethos of Black power spoke to the power of substance, right? It spoke to the power of resisting performative notions of liberation and embracing true liberation. And so with this Black power era, of course, came very sophisticated very draconian, unrelenting assaults on the Black men, the Black women, and even the Black children. Yes, indeed, the Black youth. And we see this in the COINTELPRO records, federal government records, classified, now declassified records, that the US government had every intention to put Negroes in their place, which also meant authorizing whether the federal government and national security bodies at the state level, as well as the local level, local and county levels, to kill members of the Black Panther Party on sight. And so as Black Power now is in many ways retreating in the late 1960s into the early 1970s, some Black Power militants, members of the former Black Panther Party members, realized that they must incorporate one of Malcolm X's greatest aspirations to liberate the Negro masses. And in fact, the struggle for civil rights, the struggle for Black freedom in the United States must incorporate and must integrate aspects of the continent, the hemisphere, and the entire world. And Malcolm envisioned the Organization of Afro-American Unity, in which he literally meant that all people of African descent, anyone who's of Afro-American descent, meaning you reside in the Americas, must be working towards this collective liberation struggle. And so from civil rights to Black Power to Pan-Africanism. And the connections between Black nationalism of the Black Panther Party to Pan-Africanism was very clear and it was quite robust. And so by the early 1970s, specifically 1971, an African-American gentleman, a young man who was very much an acolyte of Malcolm X, very much rooted in the Black Power tradition of the Black Panther Party for self-defense, traveled with some comrades to the African continent, first to Addis Ababa, and then he was invited to Mozambique, where members of Frelimo, the liberation movement of African brothers and African sisters in Frelimo, shared with him the struggles against Portuguese colonialism and Portuguese supremacy on the African continent. This gentleman, his name was Owusu Sadokai. Sadokai simply asked his African host, his revolutionary African host, what can your kindred across the Atlantic do for you? How can we augment the liberation struggles here on African soil, on ancestral lands? To which Frelimo said, we need material support. We need moral support. We need personnel. Remember us. Remember that we are waging a body for a body struggle for our existence, not just as Africans on the continent, but what we fight for will reverberate throughout the African world, meaning those who are in the United States and the Americas. Sadokai realized this is brilliant, so he returns to the United States in the summer or the fall of 1971 and helps to establish a committee for the purposes of African liberation. 1 year later, in 1972, Sadokai and comrades throughout the United States, throughout the Eastern Caribbean, and Canada as well, have established African Liberation Day celebrations in May of 1972, which would be the inaugural gathering. And it's important that I share very quickly with you Sadokai's words in terms of why there was such reticence, sometimes resistance, and sometimes a sense of melancholy where the regular civil rights movement was concerned, where so many people felt it wasn't doing enough considering the onslaught to which Black people were subjected. Sadokai said, and I quote, "The only thing that has changed is new Black faces in high white spaces." The only thing that has changed is new Black faces in high white places. Sadukai lamented these words in a speech in April 1972. In fact, in the city of Toronto, where he was helping to organize to ensure a continental movement. By May 1972, a very historic moment in the history of North America, 65,000 Black people marching in 6 locations on the North American mainland, including Toronto, Washington, D.C., and the Bay Area, and San Francisco in particular, as well as St. John's, Antigua. African Liberation Day allowed the masses of Black people, African peoples, to participate in direct political action that impacted the liberation struggles that were taking place in all parts of Southern Africa, not just Mozambique. Knowing the significance of the African griot, or the storyteller, or the keeper of the sacred knowledge, that is the historian or history to African peoples, their freedom struggles, and the Black radical tradition, the eminent Guyanese historian by the name of Walter Rodney, brilliant intellectual Walter Rodney, in San Francisco in May 1972, before thousands of men, women, and children, said, and I quote, that African Liberation Day, and broadly the liberation and freedom struggles of African peoples, constituted an act of identification. An act of identification. Now, Walter Rodney was one of the fiercest critics of African and Caribbean neocolonialism and the petty and national bourgeoisie that exploited the African masses in this hemisphere, as well as on the African continent, at the behest of the European and other corporate powers. Rodney pointed out that this act of identification was so important because it encouraged African peoples who had endured Middle Passages and endured this protracted 400-year genocidal struggle. It inculcated this desire, right, to reject Western hegemony and to embrace one's African identity and consciousness as acts of revolution. In other words, that revolution is not just picking up arms. In fact, that's a minor aspect. The most significant aspect, and this is really important to our very beloved teachers and educators in the room, revolution is not a violent call to arms. Revolution is, how do we liberate the minds of our precious little boys and girls? How do we liberate the minds of African peoples as a result of what we've endured vis-a-vis this Ma'afa, as Dr. Marimbani points out? So the subtext of African Liberation Day, and I'll conclude momentarily here, is that because the United States, Canada, and the various neocolonial governments in the Caribbean, as well as in Africa, denied the Black masses material security and dignity, it was incumbent upon Black people to help liberate the continent of their ancestors. And keep in mind that this is what the late, great Marcus Mosiah Garvey, arguably one of the most important, or the most important person of African descent in the 20th century. Pardon the musical in the background. The 3-year-olds do have a mind of their own. Adjetey. Not your daddy, but you probably find it. Hold on. Thank you. As Marcus Garvey pointed out without fail, when Africa is free and united under one flag, when Africa is free and united under one flag, Black people around the world will become free. Furthermore, this notion of back to Africa, which Garvey often invoked, although his detractors would use it as a point of critique, was more than physical repatriation. Back to Africa, as Walter Rodney asserted, was an act of identification. It linked the fates of African peoples in their pursuit of self-determination and their opposition to capitalist exploitation. At the 1972 African Liberation Day commemoration that was taking place throughout this North American continent, including the Eastern Caribbean, what was playing out in San Francisco with Walter Rodney was equally playing out in Washington, D.C. Congressman Charles Diggs Jr. highlighted the spirit of the occasion. And he said, and I'll borrow his words, Black people in America and Black people in the Caribbean understand that our African past is intimately bound up with our African future, end quote. And various luminaries echoed this theme and sentiment, such as Elaine Brown, who had become chairwoman of the Black Panther Party for self-defense by 1974, the writer and Black arts movement pioneer Miri Baraka, the celebrated reparations advocate and Pan-African nationalist Queen Mother Audley Moore, and Roy Ennis, who was chairman of the Congress of Racial Equality. Yeah, Jay. Hey, play music. As some protesters waved the Garveyite tricolor red, black, and green in Washington, D.C., but as well as in San Francisco and other points on the North American mainland, Owusu Sadukai proclaimed to the Black masses in his impassioned speech for global African liberation. And he led the chant, "We are an African people. We are an African people." African Liberation Day indeed was an act of identification. This notion of knowing thyself is so important. Actually, is so important in terms of how we teach our children, in terms of how we teach even students at the university level. African Liberation Day was about ensuring substance in the Black freedom struggle. Substance over performance, substance over vapid notions of freedom. Substance entails to know thyself. Thank you all so much for your patience. This little one, now he's playing some African instrument in the house, so I cannot get him to stop, but I do appreciate your patience and forgive me.
I don't want to forgive you for anything. I think it's fantastic. I feel like he made the talk better. It was just a constant reminder in the background of what, this is who it is. No apology needed. I want to take just a couple of minutes. I'm going to unspotlight both of us, Wendell, and say thank you to you. Excuse me. Unmute myself there. My throat is terrible. Okay, before we go on to the next session, I just want to share a couple of things with you. This is, excuse me, what Wendell shared with you. Oh my goodness, I can't speak.
Do you need a Jane?
Yeah, could somebody else maybe?
Okay, sure. I can jump in here. These resources were developed by Shane, but again, thinking about what Wendell said and that significance, that importance, know thyself, right? Think about how we can help you or how you can draw upon your community, your relatives, to learn about your history and your past. Next slide.
I'm good now. Okay.
All right, Shane.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So as you are thinking about what you just heard, I want you to think back about these questions for reflection for you before. And we don't have a whole lot of time right now, but I just wanted to remind you of them and think about, I think this third one in particular, what can you bring to the surface in your classroom? Perhaps part of what you heard today is an answer to that question. And I came up with a series of questions for students if you decided you wanted to teach about African Liberation Day. This is a set of questions that can be answered using a combination of Dr. Adjetey's talk and also some of the resources that we have provided. These are for younger students and older students. So I looked at the Children's Africana Book Awards and Africa Access, and spoke with Brenda at Howard, and found this is just a subset of a few of the books. There's both historical fiction and nonfiction, both picture books and older chapter books that are available. So if you teach elementary school, these are not specifically about African Liberation Day, but there are a number of them that are about, especially Southern Africa, that would draw a connection, so that if you're teaching that in elementary school, the kids would be then prepared as they're older to learn about African Liberation Day. I think that gets to the question that people were asking also about, how do you teach children about this? And, I also had experiences with my dad teaching me things at home that did not show up in the curriculum. But I also would like to say that we all pay taxes and the schools owe us this. So this is also for teachers as, what is it possible for you to actually do in the classroom within the constraints of your curriculum. There are also a bunch of resources for older students and teachers, and these images just indicate a handful of them. I linked to a whole bunch of them, but they include some books for you, including Dr. Adjetey's book. They include archives like the African Activist Archive, which includes, posters, photographs, all kinds of stuff online. They include films like the Black Power mixtape is one example. And single primary source images. And then also what I included in the list of resources is fully completed lesson plans that already exist. So this is from Zinn on COINTELPRO. But you'll find that there are a number of different things that are out there already. And so there is not a single lesson out there on African Liberation Day, but there are many related lessons, and there are lots of pieces of information that you could use in association with it. And so in the slide deck is just this resource list right here. Susan, I just saw your face in the chat and realized, or in the list, and realized that I didn't ask you to participate here. I wasn't sure you were there. I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. It's okay. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I will identify the Susan was the person who brought us the archive and a couple of films, and so when you see that, if you link to it, you'll see a number of different options there. So the short version here is just to say that between the recording of the talk that Dr. Adjetey just did and these resources, it is well within your power to teach about this. How you can fit it into your curriculum is a different question, but I think there are many potential ways depending upon where you're teaching. And I will stop sharing right there for a minute